The legacy of educational segregation and systemic racism in Oxnard, California. In the early 20th century, the education system in Oxnard, California became a stark example of systemic racism and segregation. Mexican American children were subjected to inferior schooling environments specifically designed to perpetuate racial inequalities. Schools were not simply segregated due to community preference or logistical necessity. They were intentionally structured to ensure that white students received better funding, facilities, and educational opportunities, while Mexican American students were relegated to underfunded and overcrowded institutions. These discriminatory practices were not just a reflection of individual prejudices, but were deeply embedded within legal, political, and social systems that actively sought to uphold racial hierarchies. This presentation will examine how systemic racism operated within Oxnard's school system and how its legacy continues to shape modern education. By analyzing Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist and two other research articles, I will uncover the deep roots of racial segregation in education. We will also discuss the ways in which segregation persists today through modern practices like academic tracking, biased disciplinary policies, and disparities in school funding. Understanding these issues is the first step toward addressing them and working toward a truly equitable education system. My first claim is that systemic racism is embedded in policies and practices as seen in Oxnard's historical segregation of Mexican American children. Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist provides a crucial framework for understanding how racism extends beyond individual actions to institutional policies. Kendi argues that racist policies are those that produce or sustain racial inequality between racial groups. In the context of Oxnard, Mexican American children were deliberately placed in underfunded school through policies that restricted their access to quality education. These policies weren't just about individual racism or biases held by teachers. They were perpetuated through governmental decisions, local laws, and school board practices that preserved white privilege. By applying Kendi's analysis to the educational system in Oxnard, we can see that discrimination faced by Mexican American students was not simply the result of biased attitudes, but was perpetuated by state-sanctioned policies. These policies created a cycle of inequality that persists today, revealing how systemic racism continues to shape educational opportunities. The broader implication is that racism must be actively challenged at the policy level rather than treated as an individual moral failing. My second claim is that discrimination within Mexican American communities was compounded by colorism, where darker-skinned children experienced more severe exclusion. In this, we explore how skin tone plays a crucial role in discrimination, especially within Latino communities. Through research, I have found that darker-skinned Mexicans often face heightened discrimination, a phenomenon called colorism. In Oxnard, this hierarchy of color likely meant that lighter-skinned Mexican American children might have been treated with less prejudice and given better access to educational resources, while darker-skinned students faced harsher segregation and exclusion. This reality demonstrates that discrimination is multi-layered. While all Mexican American students faced segregation, the intensity of their exclusion was often determined by skin tone. Colorism in the context of Oxnard schools adds another layer of complexity to racial discrimination that Mexican American children faced. It wasn't just about being Mexican or non-white, but about the specific shade of skin that determined the kind of treatment students received. This deepened divides within the Mexican American community itself, further entrenching social inequalities. The persistence of colorism today suggests that racial justice efforts must also address internalized prejudices within racial communities. My third claim is about mundane racism through everyday practices within the school system perpetuated segregation. Through research, the concept of mundane racism, which refers to everyday, seemingly neutral actions that perpetuate racial inequalities. In Oxnard, mundane racism was evident in how Mexican American children were treated. For example, they were often segregated within classrooms based on criteria like perceived intelligence or behavior, and even when placed in integrated classrooms, they were often treated as exceptional rather than part of the general student body. This embedded routine racism further entrenched segregation without explicitly acknowledging it as such. Mundane racism can be even more insidious than overt discrimination because it operates under the guise of fairness. By disguising it as a matter of ability or hygiene, school officials were able to justify racial separation without acknowledging its racist underpinnings. This mundane racism wasn't limited to the actions of a few individuals, but was built into the everyday workings of the educational system. It shows how systemic practices of segregation were sustained in ways that were so normalized that they often went unnoticed or unchallenged, even by those in power. My fourth claim is that legal and political justifications for segregation cemented the educational exclusion of Mexican American children. The legal system played a crucial role in sustaining educational segregation. In California, the state's educational policies and court rulings like the infamous Mendez versus Westminster case justified the separation of Mexican American children by arguing that they were inherently different from white children and required separate facilities or classrooms. These legal arguments were based on racial stereotypes and served to perpetuate educational inequality for a generation. Although Mendez versus Westminster ultimately ruled against segregation, similar arguments persisted in different forms. Many school districts found loopholes to continue segregating students using tracking systems, special education placements, and selective admissions policies. This demonstrates how the legal framework that upheld segregation had long-lasting consequences, even when explicit segregation was formally abolished. The Mendez versus Westminster case, although a significant victory for desegregation, was a part of a larger framework of racialized legal justifications that sought to keep Mexican American children in separate, unequal settings. My last claim is about the long-term effects of educational segregation that have created lasting disparities in educational outcomes for Mexican American students. The historical segregation of Mexican American children in Oxnard schools has had long-lasting effects. Even after desegregation, the residual impact of discriminatory practices can be seen in the ongoing disparities in educational outcomes. Schools in historically segregated areas remain underfunded with fewer resources, lower teacher quality, and higher dropout rates among Mexican American students. These disparities are a direct result of historical segregation that denied these students an equal chance at success. The educational inequalities are not just historical injustices. They have real and measurable effects on students today. A lack of access to advanced coursework, fewer extracurricular opportunities, and limited college counseling services all contribute to lower college attendance rates among Mexican American students. Without targeted interventions and increased funding, the cycle of inequality will continue, leaving future generations at a disadvantage. The persistent inequalities in education are a clear reflection of how deeply the legacy of segregation still affects communities. The underfunding and lower quality of schools that serve Mexican American children contribute to the reproduction of educational inequalities, reinforcing the cycle of racial disparities. These issues aren't merely residual, they are an ongoing consequence of policies and practices that were designed to maintain inequality. Without systemic changes, these disparities will continue to shape the future of Mexican American students, limiting their social and economic mobility. In conclusion, the segregation of Mexican American students in Oxnard schools is not merely a historical injustice. It is a case study in how systemic racism operates through legal, social, and institutional structures. The research examined in this presentation highlights how educational segregation was not an accident or a temporary injustice, but an intentional practice designed to uphold racial hierarchies. Ibram X. Kendi's work demonstrates that systemic racism is maintained through policies that create and reinforce racial inequalities. The research by Marrow's findings on colorism show that racial discrimination is often layered, with skin tone playing a significant role in determining how individuals experience prejudice. Finally, the concept of mundane racism highlights the everyday practices that made school segregation appear normal and justified, ensuring its persistence for decades. The fight for educational equity is not just about looking back at history. It is about ensuring that future generations do not suffer the same barriers to success. Recognizing the deep roots of segregation is the first step, but action is necessary to create meaningful change. By acknowledging these historical injustices and advocating for policy reform, we can work toward a school system that offers all students, regardless of race or background, an equal opportunity to succeed. Thank you.